Number 26, I believe there's more to do on the left-hand side. I can change the cosecants into 1 over sines. Purposefully creating complex fractions, a complex fraction. When you have a complex fraction, you want to multiply everything by the least common denominator of all of your fractions. Least common denominator between all of those will just be sine. So I multiply the top and I multiply the bottom by sine. Sine times the fraction with 1 over sine gives me a 1. Sine times the negative 1 gives me negative sine. Sine times the fraction 1 over sine gives me a 1. And then sine times the 1. And that problem was very quick. Same kind of problem here. I like the 1 over cosecant over here to change those into 1 over sines. Purposefully creating the complex fraction. Multiply everything on the top by sine, everything on the bottom by sine. You can get away with that because when you multiply top and bottom by the same, you're really multiplying by 1. Sine times the fraction cancels the sine. Sine times the plus 1. Sine times the fraction cancels the sine. And sine times the negative 1. And that is the target in a hurry. I like the secant changed to 1 over cosines. Least common denominator would be cosine. Cosine in the 1 gives me a cosine. Cosine in the fraction cancels the denominator, leaves me with a 1. Cosine in the 1 gives me a cosine. Cosine in the fraction cancels the denominator, gives me a 1. And that was the target in a hurry. Here I'm going to get a least common denominator. Least common denominator between 1 plus sine and cosine will be the two things, cosine and then the group. To go from a 1 plus sine, this first fraction, to the new denominator, I need to pick up the cosine. I already have a cosine. I now have cosine squared. From the second fraction with a cosine to the new fraction, I need to pick up the group, 1 plus sine. I already have a 1 plus sine. I now have 1 plus sine squared. Take a look at your target. A 2 secant is the same thing as 2 over a cosine. So those 1 plus sines, really, they need to go. I'm going to multiply the group 1 plus sine times itself. That gives me a 1 plus 2 sine plus sine squared. Over. Do I distribute? Do I not? I'm not going to distribute because I'm going to hope that I can cancel this group. And if I need to, I can always come back and distribute. I see a cosine squared, I see a sine squared in the top. Even though they're not side by side, I can replace those with a 1. The way we get things to cancel is we need to figure out a way that we can factor. Up on top, I see a 1 and a 1. I can make that into a 2. And I'm going to factor out the 2 in my next step. Do that up here. So I'll pull out the 2. That leaves me with 1 plus a sine over my cosine and my 1 plus a sine. Cancel out the 1 plus sines. That leaves me with 2 over cosine. And 2 over cosine is the same thing as 2 secant. And that was my target. Number 33. I think I have more to work with, even though I see a bigger fraction, but the cotangent, I want to change that. So I'm going to change that into 1 minus cosine over sine. creating that complex fraction. I'll multiply the top and the bottom by sine. Sine times the 1 gives me a sine. Sine times the 1 gives me a sine. And sine times the fraction allows the sine on the bottom to cancel. And that was my target. That was quick. Number 34. I'm going to, let's see, I want cosine eventually, so if I can figure out a way of getting rid of that sine squared, that would be nice. And I can. Sine squared is the same thing as 1 minus cosine squared. That parentheses really wasn't needed at that time. I can factor that into the groups 1 minus cosine and 1 plus cosine. The 1 plus cosines cancel, so I have 1 minus the grouping, 1 minus cosine. Get rid of my grouping symbols. Allows the 1s to cancel. And that was my target.